Welcome to the CRO Talks podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. All right, today we're going to talk testing big and testing small. So like scale of testing, like complexity, or is it, when you think about scale, is it like the results of the test? How easy or difficult is it to build? All these little things. And this topic was brought up by one of our regular roundtable attendees, Shirley Lee. So shout out to Shirley for bringing this topic to the roundtable and generating some great discussion around it. So first, we want to start off with saying not all tests are created equal, right? There's a difference between level of input and level of output, and I'm sure you've seen this as well in all of the whatever hundreds or thousands of tests that you've created too, Iqbal.
Hundreds of thousands.
Oh, hundreds of thousands. Yeah. So yeah, there you go. Sometimes a very simple test build will yield a huge uplift result, or vice versa. Like sometimes a really complex test build only produces a small, minuscule amount, right? So there's discrepancy there. So how do you kind of sort through? This kind of gets into like meta topic around test prioritization as well a little bit, because you don't want to waste time on something that's not going to give you a good ROI.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. There's the ROI aspect, but there's also the scale of testing. What scale of testing should you do? And as part of that, there's like there's a question in terms of why they're asking that question. Is there a belief that there's a correlation between the amount of dev hours spent on a test, the amount of time spent working on a test, with the scale of the impact? So that is it that? Is it basically they're trying to get a bigger scale of a result, or is it that they want to try and progress a feature or a design or a page on a website really quickly, and so they want to make a bigger strides? So there is a question in terms of why they're asking that question, and that kind of has some sort of bearing on the way that you would approach resolving that, if you see what I mean. So that's the first thing.
Right. Yeah. So it comes down to really two different things when we're looking at like the scale of the experiment, right? Scale of impact and scale of change, right? So amount of work that goes into building the test, and then the amount of value you get from the result, right? So so how do you quantify those? Well, as with most tests, like there's some pre-planning exercises that you can do there to try and evaluate, what that scale is for any given experiment. So
is that the three types of tests that you get?
No. First we're just defining like what things to look at in terms of scale, and then next is like sort of quantifying like creating like meta classifications within that scale as well, right? So so scale of impact is right the test result, like is this test going to potentially generate $1 million or $1,000? Well, you probably want to focus on the $1 million experiment. Maybe not, right? So how do you figure that out first? So to evaluate scale of impact prior to actually doing all the work of building the test, what are some of the metrics or pre-planning strategies to try and determine that?
This leads into Ben's LinkedIn post where he's kind of referring to
the recent
revenue.
post that Ben was talking about and Ben, we're talking about Ben LeBay.
Ben LeBay, yeah. And so he was saying how that he wants to move away from PXL as a prioritization framework to something based on predicting or sort of projecting sort of a range of
Right.
potential sort of revenue win to do with that. I think if you go back to the core of this, there's a scale of impact which if that is the question that is leading the whole we want to test big, then there is this idea of like, okay, so we want to test big, but what does that mean in terms of the types of tests that we run? And in terms of like types of tests that they run or that teams run, they generally are asking about, like senior level are asking about, hey, I want big wins, right? Whereas the testing teams, yes, they're interested in the wins for the senior level, but they're more kind of on the ground thinking about the actual stuff that goes into the test, how many changes are going into the test, and what constitutes an experiment. Am I way off there? But
I don't necessarily think so, but you're leading into scale of change, and you're kind of intimating that there's a correlation there when it's not necessarily true.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah. So I think in terms of that's the and that feeds into this false sort of view, I guess,
That we
that
need to make big changes to get big impacts.
yeah. I mean, I go back to the manga. If in doubt, go back to manga, um, where
I
Fist of
want
the
to
North
where
Star.
I was gonna say, where's this leading?
Yeah. Fist of the North Star. You remember Fist of the North
Uh-huh.
Star?
I do.
Kenshiro,
Yeah.
the hero. So he'd often make some very small, seemingly minor moves as part of his sort of attack on or defense on somebody, and those seemingly small moves would be targeted towards specific pressure points, which would have devastating consequences on his opponent. And in terms of an experiment, it's kind of the same way, where basically you could make big, huge changes, but if you're not really hitting a pressure point, then you're not really going to move the needle. So,
That's a
yes,
really
while
good analogy, right? So it's like you can do a big transformative change, but that's riskier. It's less likely to pay off. Like you
yeah,
don't you
yeah,
don't you don't know if it's gonna hit.
yeah,
Whereas like
exactly.
a smaller, more focused change is more likely to have a positive impact, but that positive impact may be smaller. But
Yeah,
in aggregate over time, you can do many small things versus one big, large thing.
yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like and with
I have my own
and
analogy for this as well, which we can
cool,
go
cool,
through.
cool. And with the going back to what I was saying, that's what I was kind of getting at when I was saying like senior level, they're looking at the big impact, whereas
Right.
the people doing the work, they're the ones who are throwing jabs at the site, and the senior management are those who are just looking at, okay, you're throwing a whole load of punches, but I don't see anything happening, sort of deal. But let's get to your analogy on this.
Okay, so my analogy for this, and I don't remember, I didn't come up with this originally. I saw it somewhere else ages ago, and I was like, "This is brilliant. I'm going to steal it and use it all the time and pretend that it's mine." And that is that experimentation is kind of like mining for diamonds.
Mm,
So you're digging down through the mine. You're doing a lot of work to find one single diamond. That's your big disruptive test. You're having to do a lot of work to find that one small thing. But then the true value of once you found that is in like the you can exponentially increase the value of a diamond by doing all the cutting and the polishing, right, and making it into a gemstone rather than the raw unrefined ore. you know.
Mm.
And so iterative testing is that process of like polishing and cutting and like optimizing or mitigating the risk of the big payoff.
So is that kind of
And
like a framework? That's the framework
yeah,
for
yeah, that's the kind
for
of the way that I think of it. And I also think like you need to do both as well. Like you can't just solely focus on like doing big risky things
Mhm.
because a lot of the time they're not going to pay off. But on the flip side, you can't only just focus on small iterative things because you may end up just hitting a local maxima where you're like, oh, we're improving revenue by, $20,000 a month, whereas some bigger change that pays off could increase it by like, 100,000 a month or something, right? So you're hitting like a false peak there. So you always want to introduce that risk and doing a big transformative thing. Because also with like the big transformative test where you're changing lots of stuff or changing a big thing all at once, well, it might not pay off, but you're in terms of like actual like revenue ROI or whatever your primary metric is, but you're probably going to learn something from that. Like, oh, how did that affect user behavior in different ways on different areas of the site? Like did it change funnel behavior? There's all these different things like you can analyze, but then you can pick that apart to figure out, okay, here's now new areas that we can focus on. Like we saw
Mm.
something interesting that we can then hone in on through iterative testing to get value out of, right? So your big test is your like you're mining for diamonds, you're doing your prospecting, you're finding the ore, and then you're using your small iterative changes to capitalize on that, right? So you
Yeah,
have to
that's a
do a
good way of
healthy mix of making sure that you're doing both things.
yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Shall okay, shall I take you through the framework of the way that I approach this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because so the way that I balance it, I mean, I don't stick to like any kind of like hard and fast rule, but I at least like like tag up experiments in some way of like this is iterative, transformative, disruptive, or whatever. Which and the iterative,
Yeah,
transformative, disruptive nomenclature, that's also something that we've picked up from Spiro as well. They have a
yeah.
blueprint for it that we can use. If you're not aware already, like Spiro stuff is a great resource for experimenters. Like a lot of their blueprints that they produce and things like that. So definitely go check that stuff out. But
I tried this iterative, disruptive, and transformative approach with a couple of clients actually.
mm-hmm.
And I have to be honest, I couldn't get it to work. I think the problem with it was that the definitions, how do we define when does something fall into iterative or
Yeah,
transformative or
well,
disruptive?
it's meant as like a framework or like right,
Yeah,
like a process concept. You have to take it and refine it for you
yeah,
specifically of like right, like we're not like we're providing you a framework of like here's like a scale. Now you have to
mhm.
create the definitions of like what slots into each like scale and section and how you classify and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. I think it is useful.
Mhm.
It didn't help me specifically when dealing with this sort of question, this sort
Yeah.
of problem. And what I've kind of the approach I kind of take with this with the teams that I kind of coach and train and support basically is to go back to basics.
Yeah.
So if we think about what is a hypothesis is a prediction that a change or a specific to a change to a specific independent variable will have a specific impact on a dependent variable. So you have an independent variable that you're changing, and then a dependent variable that you think is going to be impacted. And then when you break it down in those terms, yeah, there's a few misconceptions there that lead into all sorts of problems. Like the the idea that an independent variable is something that's somehow fixed, but it's actually quite a fungible concept, meaning that you could have a CTA button and that could be a variable, but when you break it apart, you have lots of variables inside that. You got button color, text, contrast.
Hmm.
So lots of variables contained inside another variable. And the other thing to take into account, and that people don't take into account, is that uh, along for the ride of your experiment are confounders. So these are, as well intentioned as we may be in saying that this is the independent variable we're changing, we often change a whole bunch of other variables
Yeah.
as a consequence of changing that.
Right.
And
You're dealing with altering a UI, and everything's interconnected, right? Nothing exists in isolation, right? Like maybe you change the headline of something or something, right? And the new headline is a little bit longer than the other one. And so, on smaller breakpoints, that causes layout, like that pushes stuff a little bit further down the page, right? Like and that's not something that you
exactly.
can control for.
And that's a confounding variable. So I think the first thing is to identify that it's important to identify as many of those variables as possible. So not just the independent variables, but all of the confounding variables. So basically, you almost need to make an itinerary of all of the independent variables are changing. Now, to go to the dependent variable in terms of the what is the variable of interest that we want to move, well, that's also kind of a very fungible concept because it's a variable of interest and it's usually set to conversion rate, but it's often useful to shift it closer to the point of change so you can actually see the impact on the change to the independent variable and the impact to the dependent variable. So when you put those two together, you have a whole bunch of components, the building blocks there, in order to decide how you want to isolate variables, because
Right.
it's a decision of either between learning or moving quick. And often the people would say, well, we want a little bit of both, right? So it's not just that they want to move quick; they want to also learn while they're
Which
moving quick.
which phase are you in at any given time? Like, uh, if you're in the learning phase, do a lot of big change, like experiment, be risky because you don't know what the payoff is going to be. If you hit on
Well,
something, great, but you're still like,
but even before that, even at the planning
oh, okay, even
stage,
before that,
right?
yeah,
Even at the planning stage, you're thinking you want to, what kind of test do we want to plan to do? And there's an idea that say we want to progress our homepage, and we want to progress that quite rapidly. So because we want to implement a whole bunch of design changes. So, but at the same time, we want to learn while we're implementing all of those design changes. So then it's a kind of like, so when it comes to isolating those variables, just knowing what the building blocks are in terms of the independent variables, the confounders that come along with the independent variables, and the dependent variables that you're trying to move, and the fact that there's a whole bunch of unknown dependent variables. Well, now you've got the building blocks to build a strategy to kind of go, okay, what can I bundle in terms of independent variable changes
yeah,
based on
yeah.
the impact and based on the confounders that are along for the ride and based on the risk of additional confounders coming along for the ride, and what kind of experiment design would that entail. And with that, you can kind of put together a strategy based on, like, on the sliding scale of learning versus moving quick, in terms of like how do you bundle those, what do we call a variable, what are the confounders here, what variables do we want to change, what dependent variable are we looking at. So yeah, that's kind of the way it's a complex way of looking at it on the face of it, but it kind of gives you a lot of flexibility, just knowing that you got to break things down into variables, and then you can build things back up again in terms of what the experiment should look like, and then based on requirements and goals.
Yeah, now I think that's more for, well, not more for, but it's like in terms of like individual experiment design, like hammering out like these are the things that are going to change and be affected by the experiment itself, and creating like a sense of like focus and cohesion. So like
Yeah,
as a practical like hypothetical example that I'm like building out in my head. So say you want to run like you've used analytics and stuff to identify like, okay, there's a bit like we have a gap in our add to cart rate, right? So we want to run tests on our product page because we want to increase add to cart rate. We want to get more items in the cart for XYZ reasons, right? So okay, so we have some test ideas. We want, and one test focuses on like making a stylistic change to the call to action area. You know, like maybe like putting a background on it, increasing the font size so it stands out more, something like that, right? So the confounding variables are going to be like behaviors that exist within the CTA space. So like clicks on the add to cart button. Maybe if you have like a one-click pay, like an alternate payment gateway, like PayPal or something that exists on the product page. If you have like attribute selections for the product, like, you know, you have to select size or color or things like that. Like, how are those behaviors going to be affected? For that test design, you're not necessarily an example of like a variable that's not confounding would be like users scrolling down to and reading like the review section. Like the review, like that section is fairly divorced from the CTA area, so it's not a confounding variable. So if you're designing a test on the product page and your test design is like changing all of these bits and bobs in different areas on the site, right? Like that's your scattershot approach. Like it's not creating a uniform design, so it's less likely to have any kind of payoff, even though you're seemingly having a bigger scale experiment. Is that sort of like a more like theoretical example of like how to think
Yeah, kind
through
of.
that?
I mean, the first thing is that this kind of approach is not really specifically, or is useful at an experiment level, but also at a more kind of roadmap level as well. So, and it's kind of like a strategy level, based on your goals and based on your needs and stuff like that. Knowing that uh, independent variable is a fungible concept, and the hypothesis that you're going to be the prediction that you're making, it's basically it's based on what you want to learn, and so knowing that you can group certain variables together, like say for instance your whole thing is about a theme, social proofing. It's very hard to make a change like that, adding social proofing without adding a whole bunch of confounding variables. But
Yeah,
but if you say that that level of change is my is what I want to learn about. I want to learn whether or not social proofing moves the needle in terms of number of people who click on that buy button or something like that. So then now you've got like this social proof box or whatever as your independent variable. Now inside of that, you've got a whole bunch of other variables, and you need to just know or note that these variables exist and they're inside that. And you've got around that a whole bunch of confounding variables, some of which you'll probably some as many of which you want to try and target, nail down to say, yep, this is changing, this is changing, this is changing. And now, based on all of that information, you can predict, say, okay, this, if I see this impact, what will I learn? And then you can start to break apart, go into those variables, and try and say, okay, what variables can I control? Should I control? Maybe with an ABC test, an AB or an MVT, maybe just break something out into separate tests. Things that are maybe not required, maybe design change or something that you can actually take away from that without having so much of a big impact. But now you're in much more control
right.
over the
And you
level
can
of
apply
change you're
that to the
making.
context of your program and your access to resources, right?
Yes, yes,
Because something to think about here as well is right, a lot of this applies within the context of the scale of your uh, experimentation resources, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
if you're a 1 or 2 person team, you probably don't have a huge, massive like backlog of like hundreds of tests that you're wanting to run at any given time. So
yeah,
there's less emphasis here on like, okay, like digging through and creating this like high quality prioritization system, right? It's sort of like a crawl, walk, jog, run kind of scenario. Like
yeah.
don't get overly granular with your uh, pre work here
Mm.
if it's going to slow you down from being able to execute.
Yeah, so say your goal is to progress the design of your homepage. So now you know that you're going to bundle variables aggressively, and you know what the impact is going to be in terms of learning. But maybe you're happy to sacrifice those learnings, maybe happy to risk those learnings in order to move fast. So now, because you know that you can move, you do have that option of moving quickly by bundling those variables, and then you can strategically bundle those variables in various ways to reduce that risk. You can then sort of project out like what happens if that test is a loss for whatever reason, because that's really the only thing perhaps in this scenario that you're
Planning
worried about.
forward, like, okay, what uh doing like a pre-mortem, like what
Oh,
happens
like a
in
pre-mortem,
different scenarios based on the like, if this is the result, what do we do? If this is
yeah,
the result, what will we do? If this is the result, what will we do? Right? Like planning
yeah.
ahead of like what's the next thing you'll do based on the results.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then once you've done that, you might understand like when you do a bundle test, there's certain number of variables that you can perhaps take remove for the next iteration that you think are the most risky sort of ads, and for those you can kind of you know, if you know what you're doing with a pre-mortem ahead of time, knowing that you know the test is either a win, loss, or a fail, what happens in those scenarios when we bundle the tests, and then you can come up with a list of reasons why a test might fail, and you could come up with a list of metrics that could predict or that could measure that, and then you can kind of like go, okay, what do I think based on all this data, based on this analysis? What do I think I need to do as my next move after this test? Because all you're really after is in the instance that it's a win, maybe you're not after it, any sort of future learnings, you just roll it out and you move on. But in the list, in the instance that it's a loss, then that's the one that you have to pick apart. And in that sort of kind of scenario,
Yeah.
when you've
Dig
when you've got all
deeper,
of your
isolate your variables, like dig and
yeah,
see
when
how they're
you
being affected
but
and stuff.
when you've got your variables already isolated going in, and you've grouped your variables in a meaningful way for the test, then it's easier to then start to go, okay, we probably were a little bit aggressive, maybe remove these bunch of variables and then see what the impact is.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. And with doing stuff like that, it same thing applies, like scale of your organization. It's not like necessarily something you need to strictly formalize and document. Like you don't need to have like a dedicated pre-mortem write up for every test that you're going to run necessarily. If that's going to slow you down from being able to execute at the, appropriate scale for your team. If you have the
yeah,
resources and the time available to formalize that, then go ahead and add all of that additional extra documentation. You know,
yeah, yeah.
or
The way
if you're smaller and more lean, at least like think about it.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's exactly it, because basically, in even when I was testing with larger teams, majority of the times, because this is I'm a big pre-mortem fan. Majority of the times, pre-mortems are fine to be done in your head. It's just a
yeah,
something to think about, to say, you know, these are the scenarios that could happen. But in the occasions where you do have these sort of like big tests, so for example, redesigns and stuff like that are a key example of those. In those sort of instances, it's useful to do something, actually document it with the team, because you'll get a lot more out of the pre-mortem and a lot more sort of scenarios out of it, and you'd be able to have much more control over the future of this experiment and this experiment roadmap, plan, thread, whatever it is you want to call it.
Yeah, this also somewhat speaks to the importance of uh, having good telemetry in place and pre-configuring integrations for things. So
Mm.
no matter how good your design is and how much you think about it, there's probably always going to be something that you don't catch. So like you're designing your
Yeah.
experiment, you're building all of your goals out and things like that. Like, well, even within like your testing tool, unless it's like something super, super enterprise or like a bespoke system or something like that, like you're not necessarily going to be able to set up, nor would you want to, a goal for like every potential behavior to be
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be tracked, right?
Yeah.
And so that speaks to the importance of integrating your A/B testing tool with other stuff. So like feeding test and variation IDs out into Google Analytics or Microsoft Clarity or Hotjar or some session replay and heat mapping tool, so you can dig deeper on your analysis beyond what your goal data shows you. Like, you see something unexpected in your goal metrics and you want to dig deeper on that. Okay, well, maybe your testing tool has some segmentation, so you can at least do some segment analysis, like mobile behavior versus desktop behavior, new versus returning, different browsers, etc. But then even within that, that's still only telling you like what happened, right? It's just numbers. Now, okay, what's the context around those numbers? Like, why did the user do or not do a particular behavior? Okay, well, now you want to get into like looking at and watching some session replays. So you need some way to see replays for each specific variation and stuff. So making sure you having those integrations set up so you can quickly and easily find that data, and having it set up ahead of time so that it's available when you need it, because tests happen in real time. Like after the users performed that behavior, you can't go back in time and track it. Like once it's already been completed, it's been completed. You can't recreate all of the data around that behavior once it's already happened.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this leads on to another topic, which I think we could cover at a certain other point, which is how many metrics should you have for a
Yeah,
test,
that would be a good
and
one, right? Finding that
yeah,
balance.
yeah. I know, because and it's all based on that level of it going back to the independent variables, dependent variables, and the confounders and stuff like that. It all goes back to that and your idea of risk, how much you want to learn versus how quickly you want to move, and all of this kind of stuff, and also how much development effort do you want to put into it, how much analysis do you want to do, what is the method of analysis. All of those are questions that go into and kind of like dimensions to look at when you're making these sorts of decisions. But yes, I think heat mapping tools definitely do help with things like that, but you do need to have a pre-mortem in place so you know that you can view heat session replays or whatever in the segments and dimensions that you need in order to get that
So you have
that
the
level
ability
of
to
insight,
dig deeper should you need to or want
should
to.
you need to, or should you want to,
Yeah.
and what that digging deeper does, because what often happens when the pre-mortem hasn't been done is it kind of go, oh yeah, but we can slice the data in this way, and then we could just see that. But often what happens when you do that is that you realize, oh, we didn't account for a bunch of stuff in the test, which means that we can't really trust this analysis. So doing the pre-mortem means that you're able to pre-think what sort of analysis you might want to do that is super important to do, and make sure that you can do that analysis before you do it. I mean, we're getting into a lot more of the pre-modeling.
Right. Yeah.
But
Something
but
else that we haven't touched on that may affect scale of experiments that you're able to run is also access to sample size.
yes. So
Like
and
an iterative test is going to be smaller, more refined. It's a specific targeted change. Maybe it's on a smaller area of the site, it's on a specific piece of a page, or it's even on partial pages, etc. So it's going to, by its nature of being smaller scale, it's going to have a smaller sample size. Well, if your site doesn't have enough volume in terms of totality of traffic to run an iterative test, you're by your own nature limited to like doing larger scale things.
And this is where we come full circle back to Kenshiro and his sort of martial arts fighting style, and also the nature of independent variables and stuff like that. Because if, for instance, you keep an almost like a log of this independent variable changed this, and this independent variable changed that, and you list a whole bunch of stuff that happened over a series of experiments to do with a specific independent variable. Now, and also when you do your research ahead of time going into before you go into an experiment, so you're going from a problem first perspective, then going back to Kenshiro and his martial arts moves, you know where the pressure points are, and so in order to make a significant impact, so you know that perhaps changing a whole bunch of other stuff around the edges and like text and maybe imagery and whatever, maybe that that's not going to have an impact, whereas this particular banner, maybe the hero banner, maybe that the changes there are the big impact changes, and you might know that from research. And when you go into it from that perspective, then okay, when it
This is
comes
what we can
to
focus on. Like we can
this
run
is what we can focus on.
iterative testing on this part because we know
Exactly.
that making changes here has a higher level of impact, so we can trade sample size because we know it has a high. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is what I'm going back to again. This is what I mean by when you go back to basics and you break apart an experiment in terms of the constituent parts, the building blocks, the independent variables and stuff like that, and the confounders and the dependent variables, and all of the understanding those and the relationships really well. That then gives you much more of a vocabulary to improve or kind of change your strategy. You're adding vocabulary to kind of approach experiments and strategize experiments in various different ways, in much more flexible ways, in much more sort of impactful ways and effective ways.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much covers it for today in terms of at least grazing the surface on scale of testing. There's probably other opinions out there.
Yeah,
So
happy to hear.
yeah, right. As always, if any of y'all have any questions, feedback, or if you disagree with something that me or Iqbal said, you can always talk to us face to face at the CRO Roundtable every Friday. And you can find the link for that at crotalks.com. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can connect with us on LinkedIn instead. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you.